So France is basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. You've got a government that's completely collapsed, frantic negotiations for a new prime minister, and all of this is happening while a massive budget deadline looms. A budget that has to follow some super strict EU rules. We're going to break down what this actually means for your money, for pensions, for everyday life, and yeah, what could shut down next. When those nationwide strikes hit, this is what it feels like on the ground. You have tourists showing up to the Eiffel Tower, all excited only to find out it's closed. They're hoping tomorrow will be different, and that simple wish really captures the disruption that people are feeling all across the country, from packed subways to closed schools. And that question right there is the heart of this whole crisis. See, the strikes and the shutdowns, they aren't just a one-day problem. They're a symptom of a much, much deeper paralysis. To really get why, we have to look at the two massive forces that are pulling France in opposite directions. Let's start with the politics.
What you're seeing on the streets is a direct result of the absolute chaos at the top. Right now, France has a government that is, for all intents and purposes, unable to govern. And that's created this cycle of instability that has shocked even people who've been watching French politics for decades.
I mean, just look at this timeline to see how fast everything fell apart. After snap elections created a deadlocked parliament, one prime minister got forced out. His replacement, Sébastien Lecornu, announces his new cabinet on October 5th and resigns just 14 hours later. We're talking about the shortest government in modern French history. This isn't just instability, this is a system in total freefall.
And this gets us to the root of the problem, the hung parliament. Ever since those 2024 elections, no single party has had enough seats to be in control. President Macron's centrist group, well, they can't pass laws by themselves. They need to get support from opposition parties. But honestly, those other parties have zero reason to help them out. The bottom line is, without a majority, every single bill, every single reform requires these messy, painful deals. And that just leads to gridlock.
Okay, so while the politicians are deadlocked in Paris, this huge economic clock is ticking. Because France doesn't just have to answer to its own voters, it has to answer to the European Union and its very, very strict financial rules. The EU has a whole formal process for countries that spend too much. It's called the excessive deficit procedure. And right now, France is squarely in its crosshairs. And let's be clear, this isn't some friendly suggestion. It's a formal process that can come with some serious financial penalties if you don't comply.
The rule from the EU is incredibly simple. Your annual budget deficit cannot be more than 3% of your country's entire economic output. It's not a guideline, it's not a suggestion, it's one of the main pillars holding up the entire Eurozone's financial stability.
And here's the problem. France's deficit is on track to hit 5.6% next year. That's nearly double the legal limit. So you have Brussels demanding that Paris get its finances under control, which means making some really painful spending cuts, the exact kind of cuts that no French politician can get passed through a deadlocked parliament.
And this isn't just a one-year issue. The country's total debt is spiraling towards 120% of its entire economy. Think about that. That is a massive mountain of debt that gets more and more expensive to pay off every single day. And it's exactly why international markets, the lenders who buy French government bonds, are starting to get really nervous. So what do you get when you mix a paralyzed government on one side with unbreakable economic rules on the other? All of that pressure has to explode somewhere. And in France right now, that explosion is all happening around one single issue: pensions. You might remember this from back in 2023. President Macron pushed through this hugely unpopular reform that raised the retirement age by 2 years. The government argued it was absolutely necessary to keep the whole system from going bankrupt. But for millions of French citizens, it felt like a declaration of war on their way of life. And that anger, it has never gone away.
This quote from the acting finance minister just perfectly captures the impossible situation they're in. The opposition and the unions are all demanding that the government scrap the pension reform. But if they do that, it will blow an even bigger hole in the budget, making it completely impossible to meet those EU deficit rules. They are trapped financially and politically.
And this brings us right to the core of the conflict. It's a battle between what people are demanding in the streets and what the economic reality is demanding on a spreadsheet. On the street, you've got unions and protesters demanding an end to austerity. They want the pension reform reversed, they want public services protected, and they want higher taxes on the wealthy. But then you look at the spreadsheet, and it tells a completely different story. It says France has to follow the EU rules, that its debt payments are getting out of control, and that the markets need to be calmed down with a credible, responsible budget.
So with a government that can't govern and two sets of demands that are complete polar opposites, where does France go from here? Well, it looks like there are really only 3 possible scenarios ahead, and spoiler alert, none of them are particularly great.
Okay, so scenario number 1 is some kind of fragile deal. A new prime minister gets appointed and manages to make just enough painful compromises to get a budget passed. Scenario 2 is what you could call political attrition. No deal is reached, and the country just faces more strikes, more instability, and more chaos. And then there's the third option, the nuclear option. Dissolve parliament and call for new elections all over again, which risks an even worse deadlock.
All right, so as this crisis keeps unfolding, here are the 4 things you really need to be watching. First, who becomes the next prime minister, and can they actually survive? Second, what are the details of that 2026 budget proposal? Pay super close attention to any mention of the pension reform. That is the key. And finally, keep an eye on the union calendar for when they announce the next big nationwide strike.
Ultimately, this whole mess boils down to one fundamental, enormous question. When a democracy gets caught in an impossible bind between what its people demand and what its financial numbers require, which one breaks first? That's the question France is being forced to answer right now, not just for itself, but maybe for all of Europe.
Drop your question in the comments, whether it's about the budget, pensions, or even your travel plans. I'll be pinning verified updates as we hear from the new prime minister and see the actual budget text. And if you want more no-drama explanations of what's really going on, go ahead and subscribe.